March 6, 1945, Cathedral Square in Cologne, Germany. The German gunner's periscope cracked like glass under pressure, seconds before the sight of an unknown pipe appeared among the rubble. It was too long for a Sherman, too thick, too quiet. The Panther's commander hesitated for 2 seconds. It was the exact time to lose the war. For 3 years, the Panzerwaffe lived under the conviction that its armor was invincible. The 80mm gun was the answer to everything. The Tigers were myths about rails. The doctrine was simple: destroy before being seen, dominate by distance, win by technical superiority. But the one that ran through the Rhineland fields that afternoon was no ordinary tank. It was a molten steel secret, quietly designed by workmen in Detroit, shaped by an industry that had finally decided to respond. The Pershing M26 didn't come in thousands, it came in the dozens, but it brought with it a 90mm cannon and a lethal truth: the United States could match and surpass any mechanical feat of Germany. This is the story of the tank that didn't have to be numerous to be devastating, the tank that killed not only machines, but certainties. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any recorded field report or explosion. Only 20 M26 Pershing tanks saw combat in Europe, less than 1% of the American armored force. And yet, they were able to bring about more tactical breakdowns, voluntary abandonments, and hesitation among the German ranks than 1,000 Shermans ever could. The number is small, but the effect was devastating. Each appearance of the Pershing was like a shadow cast over the German belief that its Tigers were unattainable. It wasn't a battle of numbers, it was a war of perception, and Germany never knew what hit it. If you value the story told with accuracy, respect, and depth, consider leaving the like and subscribing. Your support keeps that memory alive and allows us to continue unraveling the real backstage of the war. In 1944, there was no symbol more feared on the Western Front than the German Tiger. With its 80mm KWK-36 gun, it was capable of destroying any Allied tank before it was even seen. German doctrine was structured around this technical feat, and the world believed it. The frontal armor of 100 to 150mm was considered impenetrable. The Zeiss optics, with surgical precision, allowed shots at more than 2,000 meters with a lethal hit rate. Each Tiger crew didn't just occupy a vehicle, it inhabited a myth. The rings painted on the barrels, marking destroyed tanks, resembled the marks of Luftwaffe aces. For these crews, armored warfare was an arena where they won not by numbers, but by excellence. And to some extent, that was true. In battles such as Villers-Bocage, a single Tiger held up an entire British column. In the eastern sector, dozens of T-34s were shot down before they approached. It was a war of precision against volume. But the problem with myths is that they harden, and when they harden, they don't adapt. The German High Command believed that with its superior weapons, it could win even though it was outnumbered, a technical logic superimposed on the logistical reality. The mistake was not in the engineering of the Tiger, but in the belief that it would be enough to halt the Allied advance. While Germany produced about 50 Tigers a month, the United States made more than 1,000 Shermans in the same interval, a difference of 20 to 1. And more importantly, while the Germans bet on armor, the Americans bet on replacement. An American tank could be lost, replaced, and returned to the field in a matter of days. For every Tiger shot down, dozens of new Shermans took up position, and the battlefield began to reflect this. Combats ceased to be tactical decisions and became calculations of attrition. The Panzerwaffe still won individual combats, but lost the war on the production clock. The belief in invulnerability was reinforced by local statistics, carefully selected by field commanders. What was not seen, or refused to see, was the bigger picture. Germany produced about 1,350 Tigers during the entire war. The US, by the end of 1945, had produced more than 49,000 Shermans, and they were just beginning to climb the M26. German faith in invincibility was fueled by punctual victories. The problem is that the war was no longer punctual and it was total. Defensive doctrine remained unchanged until late. Position Tigers in open fields, long-range ambushes, protect the sides with mechanized infantry. But the battlefield was changing. The Allied advance through France and Belgium, increasingly rapid, did not allow for long preparations. The Tiger, with its 57-ton weight and unreliable engine, was barely mobile, difficult to recover, and vulnerable to logistics. Meanwhile, American doctrine was learning, and he reacted. The Pershing was born out of this careful observation. Detroit engineers knew what they were up against. And they knew they didn't need to build a tank better at everything. They needed to build a tank good enough to break the myth. And breaking the myth meant something simple: being able to pierce the frontal armor of a Tiger from a distance, a task that no standard Sherman could accomplish. The 75-meter ammunition ricocheted. Only side shots at perfect angles and with special projectiles achieved damage. This turned the Tiger not only into a weapon, but into a psychological factor. The mere mention of a Tiger's presence caused hesitation. American, Canadian, and British soldiers mistook other models for it, creating the phenomenon known as Tiger fever. The real presence was smaller than imagined, but the damage was the same. In practice, the Tiger was more of a symbol than a dominant force, but it was a functional symbol until a real opponent emerged, and he would come in 1945, quietly, hidden among the Shermans. At this point in the narrative, it is worth pausing. A direct comparison. While Germany struggled to maintain a monthly production of 100 tanks, the United States produced more than 2,000 units in the same period, adding Shermans, tank destroyers, and experimental vehicles. If you were surprised by this difference, comment below. Logistics wins. Because this number defines much more than a factory, it defines the course of a war. The German doctrine, constructed with precision, would collapse in the face of simple arithmetical reality. But that was still unclear to who was in charge of the Tigers. On his radios, the belief remained: destroy before being seen, maintain position, trust steel. But on the other side of the front, someone had finally decided to respond in kind and with pent-up interest. What these crews would soon see through their periscopes would not be just another Sherman. It would be something lower, quieter, and with a longer barrel than anything they've ever faced. An American engineer had summed up the mission like this: "We want Pershing to be seen only when it's too late," and it was. Unlike the reputation it would carry in the post-war period, the M4 Sherman was not a design error. It was a doctrinal hit. Developed in 1941, before the official entry of the United States into the war, the Sherman answered a clear question posed by the War Department: how to ensure strategic superiority in multiple theaters at the same time, with a reliable, standardized vehicle ready to be produced by the thousands. The answer was not the perfect tank. It was the possible tank on a full scale. Carry enough to be transported by ships and trains. Simple enough to be assembled by civilian workers in converted factories. Standardized to the point of allowing quick exchange of parts, engines, and components between units of different battalions. The 75mm M3 gun was not the most powerful on the battlefield, but it was the most versatile. Good against infantry, pillboxes, light vehicles, and ideally, even against medium tanks. The Sherman's armor was sufficient against light weapons, but vulnerable to direct fire from 88mm guns, and the designers knew it. Still, the Sherman was a weapon of maneuver, not dueling. The American doctrine of armored warfare did not provide for frontal clashes against Tigers. It provided for speed, air cover, and coordination with mechanized infantry. While the Germans built weapons to win under ideal conditions, the Americans created machines that worked in all conditions. The Sherman could be refueled, repaired, and reactivated in the field with impressive speed. In many cases, tanks considered lost by German doctrine were towed, repaired, and brought back into line in a matter of days. The Continental radial engine, based on aviation designs, was reliable and simple to operate. The VVSS suspension system, although limited, guaranteed stability on varied terrain. But the real trump card was in what the Sherman represented to the battlefield: a constant current. While Tiger was a chess piece, Sherman was a flurry. It was common to see entire platoons of 5 or 6 Shermans operating in tandem, covering each other, encircling German positions, coordinating with airstrikes and artillery. This synergy between means compensated for the inferiority in direct dueling. In practice, the Sherman was not designed to beat the Tiger. It was designed to win the war, and in many ways, he succeeded. By 1944, for example, the Allies were already operating more than 25,000 Shermans in Europe. With each Tiger lost, it was an almost irreparable casualty for the Germans. For every Sherman lost, a new one had already landed in Antwerp, Marseille, or Naples. Allied production was a river, and the Sherman its vanguard. The Shermans' reputation as a moving coffin arose after direct engagements in Normandy, when Allied crews reported the model's vulnerability to German ambushes. But the data shows another reality. For every Sherman destroyed by a Tiger, dozens of support vehicles, infantry, and enemy positions were neutralized by the same Shermans in joint actions. It was a weapon of exhaustion, not of direct confrontation. The choice of Sherman was not therefore a limitation. It was a strategy. The Germans, on the other hand, mistook American silence for technical weakness. They considered the Sherman an inferior tank because they saw it through the eyes of an outdated doctrine, that of the chivalric duel between heavy machinery. They did not realize that they were facing a total war machine, where the tank was just a cog in a much broader industrial logic. The myth of the Sherman as a historical error is shattered by the cold analysis of the numbers. In a few months of 1944, the United States was producing more Shermans than all the cumulative production of Panthers up to that point in the war. And the most ironic, even with this massive production, the Americans were quietly preparing a replacement. One response to Tiger, a tank that embodied the best of what the Sherman had: mobility, reliability, and production standard, but with a non-negotiable differential, a gun capable of going through a Tiger's armor head-on. While the Germans laughed at the Shermans, the American engineers were already testing the T-26 prototype, and when he arrived, he would not come to compete. It would come to solve it. The question was not whether the Americans had an inferior tank. The question was, why did they choose to wait so long to show the right tank? The answer will begin to be given in the next chapter, when the first Pershings crossed the Atlantic, covered by tarpaulins and camouflaged between ordinary tanks. By September 1942, while German crews were reaping the tactical fruits of their technical superiority on the Eastern Front, American engineers were already quietly studying the future problem they would face in Europe. Analysis of the first clashes with the Tiger had made clear a critical gap. The M4 Sherman, as efficient as it was as a logistics platform, did not have the firepower necessary to face the new generation of German heavy armor. The American response would not be immediate. It would be calculated. The T-26 project was born there, still embryonic, but already with a clear objective: to create a tank capable of facing, on an equal footing, the Tiger and the Panther. The innovation would not only be in the armor or the cannon, but in the philosophy of the project. The new tank would not be a handmade piece like the German models. It would have to be produced in series along the same lines that already manufactured the Sherman. To do this, engineers at Fisher Body, a division of General Motors, worked in absolute secrecy to adapt a 90mm cannon, originally used as an anti-aircraft weapon, to a completely new chassis. That gun, the M3, would be the heart of the future M26 Pershing. With a firing speed of more than 850 meters per second and ammunition capable of piercing armor up to 220mm with HVAP shells, it broke the taboo that had paralyzed American doctrine: the impossibility of penetrating the Tiger's frontal armor. But the jump was not only offensive. The gun stabilization system, very rare in German vehicles, allowed shots with reasonable accuracy even in motion. The tower, cast in a single piece, facilitated mass production and increased resistance against direct impacts. The inclined hull armor, inspired by the Soviet T-34, offered better deflection against shells. The internal ergonomics were another differential: more space for the crew, better ventilation, less fatigue. The Pershing was, therefore, the junction of everything that worked in previous tanks with what the field urgently demanded. But the secret of success was far from the front line. He lived in Detroit at the Grand Blanc tank arsenal, where entire factories had been converted from civilian to military production in a matter of months. The United States didn't just design better tanks, they designed factories to produce them, and that Germany could not match. While Berlin struggled with bombing and shortages of raw materials, the Americans dominated the time. Each Pershing screw is designed to be replicable, each component designed to enter the assembly line without delays. The engine, the Ford GAF V8, was robust, reliable, and standardized. The transmission, although complex, could be assembled with parts already existing in other American vehicles, unlike what was seen in German workshops, where each Tiger required almost artisanal care. The Pershing could be finished, shipped, and sent to the front with industrial precision. The great irony is that the Germans did not know this. For the Wehrmacht High Command, the Americans would remain bound by Sherman's logic. The doctrine of quantity over quality was seen as a structural limit, but it was in fact a momentary choice. What the German generals did not anticipate was that this choice could be reversed, without losing the logistical advantage. When the first Pershings were tested in Aberdeen, Maryland, the results impressed even skeptics, and even so, the decision was kept confidential. For nearly 2 years, the United States developed a heavy tank in the shadow of war, without fanfare, without propaganda, and without its enemies noticing. When the Pershing was finally released for limited production in November 1944, there was already a logistics chain ready to receive it, and more importantly, there were trained, sworn crews under confidentiality ready to operate it. Time was on the side of the Allies, and the story of the M26 was just beginning. What no German commander could have imagined is that the first 20 examples of this new tank were already on their way to the European front, covered by tarpaulins and listed as heavy maintenance vehicles. A tank that no one knew, carrying a secret that would change everything, the ability to cross head-on the hull of a Tiger at less than 1,000 meters. And that revelation, as we shall see in the next part, would come in full force on the day that the steel rails of the Pershing touched the soil of Germany. The American logistical capacity that underpinned the creation and arrival of the Pershing was not born of improvisation, but of a deep understanding that modern wars are not won by armor or caliber alone, but by industrial pace. In 1944, as Germany struggled to maintain production lines fragmented by bombing, a lack of steel and skilled labor, the United States inaugurated a model of mechanized warfare on a scale the world had never seen. Entire factories, previously dedicated to the production of automobiles, refrigerators, or civilian bodies, were transformed in a matter of weeks into industrial centers completely dedicated to the war effort. General Motors, Chrysler, Ford, and dozens of other companies converted assembly lines with a speed that impressed even Allied observers. A phenomenon was born there that the Germans never fully understood: total mobilization without collapse. While Berlin sacrificed vital resources to keep the Tiger in production, each unit requiring thousands of hours of manual labor and precision components that were difficult to replace, Detroit produced at a continuous, standardized, and accelerated pace. The most impressive thing was not only the quantity, but the ability to switch models without interrupting the flow. The T-26, future Pershing, is the ultimate example of this ability. To introduce it, hundreds of adjustments had to be made to the lines that previously produced the Sherman. And here comes the defining element of American advantage. The change did not reduce existing production. Instead of stopping machines, recalibrating structures, or re-evaluating systems from scratch, American engineers developed modular processes. New towers, new hulls, new engines and transmissions were incorporated without a drop in the total numbers. Thus, while the Tiger required almost 300,000 hours of specialized labor per unit, the Pershing maintained the fundamental principle of American industry: standardized, interchangeable, and easy-to-produce parts. Germany simply did not have the infrastructure to compete. Their tanks needed specialized welders, high-quality steel, precision machining centers, refined optics, and experienced staff. Every disruption, whether it was a bombing, a power outage, or the loss of a train, caused delays of weeks. The United States, on the other hand, operated a supply chain that spanned continents, connecting 300 subcontractors and more than 50,000 workers just to sustain the Pershing program. It was an industrial wall whose weight even Hitler could not ignore. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support, like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. The secret was in the ability to transform difficulties into processes. While a damaged German engine required complete disassembly, the Pershing's engine could be replaced as a car component. While German transmitters required specific equipment, the Americans used standardized systems derived from civilian industry. Even the ammunition followed a more efficient logic: vast inventories, wide compatibility, and transportation facilitated by trucks produced on the same industrial lines. This explained how, in less than 3 years, the United States was able to not only maintain 3 fronts, Europe, Africa, and the Pacific, but also introduce a new heavy tank without sacrificing a single battalion in the process. The logistics made clear the contrast between the two nations. Germany fought for every piece, every liter of fuel, every meter of railroad track. The United States, by contrast, flooded ports, railroad lines, and roads with seemingly inexhaustible supplies. And from this abundance came the decisive advantage, the possibility of making mistakes. The Sherman could be lost without strategic impact. The T-26 could be improved without compromising the front line. The Pershing was ultimately a product of a country that could learn as it fought. And it is precisely this reality that would seal the fate of the Panzerwaffe, because the introduction of the M26 wasn't just technical, it was symbolic. It demonstrated that the United States had moved to a new stage of the war, absolute logistical dominance. The Pershing was living proof that the enemy could adapt, improve, and innovate faster than Germany could react. And no German commander imagined what was about to occur when the first of these tanks descended from the railway trains in Belgium, still covered by tarpaulins and catalogued as heavy maintenance equipment. The real shock would begin when they finally emerged from among the ruins of German cities, quietly displaying a cannon that would dismount in a single shot. 3 years of reliance on Wehrmacht steel. January 1945. Antwerp was covered in thick fog when the first M26 Pershing touched European soil. They came hidden, embarked in the depths of the cargo holds, always behind rows of Shermans, as if they were just more heavy maintenance equipment. The green tarps, carefully tied, prevented even American longshoremen from observing the actual outline of the vehicle. There was no announcement, no press release, no official photograph. This is how America introduced its new weapon, in the shadows. Secrecy was not doomed to spectacle but to effectiveness. Not even many mid-ranking officers were allowed to know that this new tank existed. The order issued by the General Staff was clear and immutable. The Pershing was only to enter combat if there was a real risk of contact with Tigers or Panthers, and even then only under direct command of the armored divisions. It was not a matter of caution, it was a matter of strategy. The M26 was not supposed to be exposed ahead of time. The element of surprise was as vital as the 90mm gun itself. The Atlantic crossing had been planned with almost surgical precision. The ships carrying the Pershings avoided routes where U-boats had recently been sighted. The vessels crossed the ocean in convoys, protected by destroyers and air escorts whenever the weather permitted. When they arrived in Europe, the unloading took place at dawn, under the supervision of officers who displayed orders signed directly by the Department of Artillery. Each tank was immediately loaded onto railroad cars, again hidden among Shermans, as if psychological camouflage was as important as mechanical. To the average soldier, they were just replacement vehicles. For the military drivers in charge of transport, they were only priority cargo. The great irony lay in the fact that the enemy, famous for his keen military intelligence, had no idea what was approaching. Meanwhile, the crews selected to operate the M26 were kept isolated in American facilities on the European continent, away from the other units. These men had trained for months at Fort Knox, but were forbidden to comment on any technicalities, even with other American soldiers. They lived under the silent logic of strategic projects. Those who knew too much spoke too little. For many of them, the moment of seeing the Pershing dismantled from the railway platforms was almost solemn. A machine that looked like nothing the Allies had brought up to that point. The chassis was lower, the welds cleaner, the turret more robust. The gun, even under canvas, revealed an unusual extension, too long to be confused with the Sherman's 75mm M3. In silence, the commanders assessed the weight of that secret. Within days, these tanks would be positioned behind the lines of advance, ready to be deployed where reports indicated the presence of Tigers. The front did not yet know Pershing, but he was already ready, like a card hidden in the sleeve of a nation that had learned not to underestimate the enemy. While Germany believed that the Americans remained trapped in the Sherman's technical inferiority, American engineers, operators, and generals watched the birth of a new doctrine. It would no longer be a war of blind attrition, it would be a war of industrial precision. In their early days in Europe, the Pershings were kept stationed in advanced maintenance areas. Mechanics trained specifically to operate their engines, transmissions, and electrical systems traveled with them. No risk of damage, no risk of breakdown out of context. They had been sent to face a single adversary, and the generals would not allow them to engage in premature combat. The most curious thing, however, was the contrast between this American silence and the German confidence that still dominated the front. For the Tiger and Panther crews, the Shermans remained predictable targets. The enemy remained the same as always, vulnerable at long ranges, weak in frontal penetration, easily traversed by 88mm shells. At that time, not even the most experienced German commander imagined that the United States already had a tank capable of destroying a Tiger head-on. And not just a tank, but a production line prepared to manufacture it en masse. The German underestimation was not only doctrinaire, it was emotional. They believed that their technological mastery was a constant of war, as if the Allied advance was exclusively numerical, not technical. Only 20 Pershings had arrived, but 20 were enough to change the psychological balance of the front as soon as they were seen. This transition from secrecy to real impact would begin days later, when the first reports of a different Sherman began to circulate among American radio, and, unknowingly, the Germans walked straight to the first practical demonstration of this new machine. The real shock would come in front of the ruins of the Rhineland, when a German Panther, confident of his superiority, would open fire on a tank that was never in his reconnaissance manuals. But before that, an obscure statistic almost ignored by the Germans was about to become decisive. While Germany produced fewer than 100 tanks per month in 1945, the United States had already established industrial capacity to produce more than 2,000 armored vehicles in the same period, and among those vehicles, quietly, were the first operational Pershings, ready to write the scene that would forever redefine the fate of German armored forces. Cologne's Cathedral Square seemed suspended in time on that afternoon of March 6, 1945. The ruins smoked like recent fossils of a city that was still trying to make sense of its own destruction. Among the rubble, the Panther commanded by Wilhelm Bartelborth held a position, hidden behind broken columns, a shadow of steel that still believed in the myth of German supremacy. His gunner, experienced enough to distinguish each variant of Sherman from hundreds of yards, spotted something unusual moving down the destroyed street. The silhouette was too low, the turret too wide, the barrel too long. But doctrine said it was a Sherman. The doctrine always said that. Bartelborth did not hesitate. He ordered firing at 300 meters, a distance at which his high-velocity 75mm gun was practically a guarantee of instant destruction. The Panther roared. The projectile flew in a straight line, hit the front of the American tank and ricocheted. The impact generated a shower of sparks, as if it had hit a sloping surface with an impossible angle. The German gunner retreated on the periscope. Bartelborth froze. The scene lasted less than a breath, but it was enough to knock down 3 years of technical certainty. Whatever was standing there, it wasn't a Sherman. On the American side, the Pershing Eagle 7, commanded by Sergeant Robert Early, had already calculated its response even before the impact of enemy fire. Gunner Clarence Smoyer tuned the 3mm M90 with near-clinical precision. The sight aligned with the Panther's mantlet. The stabilization of the gun kept the trajectory steady. The shot went off without hesitation, a dry jolt that seemed to dismantle the street itself. The American projectile traveled the 300 meters, carrying with it the break of an era. It hit the Panther turret, went through the frontal armor as if it had been made of wet paper, detonated inside the combat compartment, and set fire to stored ammunition. Within seconds, the German tank was filled with smoke, flames, and shrapnel. The crew did not have time to understand what had hit them. What was seen from the perspective of cameraman Jim Bates, who was filming the scene for the Signal Corps, was the exact moment when armored warfare changed direction. A Panther, until then treated with almost religious reverence by the Allies, being destroyed head-on by an American tank. The symmetry of the violence exposed a brutal truth. The era of German invulnerability was over. The duel continued. Another German tank, positioned a few meters behind, tried to take advantage of the shock to counterattack. The movement was brief. Her turret had barely begun to rotate when Eagle 7 fired again. A single shot was enough. The explosion raised a column of black smoke into the grey sky of Cologne. The silence that followed was not the silence of the end of a fight. It was the silence of the end of a belief. To the civilian population watching from shattered windows, it looked like just another exchange of fire between armored vehicles. For the Germans, who still believed in the technical superiority of their army, it was an earthquake. For the General Staff in Berlin, which would receive the reports hours later, it would be an incomprehensible threat. And for American crews, accustomed to seeing Shermans being destroyed at absurd distances, it was the first living proof that the technical scales had finally balanced. What made this duel so decisive was not the destruction itself. It was what it symbolized. For the first time in the entire war, A German tank was defeated on their territory in frontal combat by an American armored vehicle that they did not even know existed. The initial ricochet, that impossible shot that didn't penetrate, would be remembered for decades as the exact moment when German confidence splintered. The Pershing's turret, filmed by Bates as it slowly advanced, didn't just look like a machine, it seemed like a verdict. The moral impact was immediate. Radio reports over the next few hours described a Sherman with a long gun that had withstood frontal fire. No one on German soil believed that the Americans had developed a new heavy tank. Uncertainty, that invisible weapon, began to spread. The Panzerwaffe, which until then had maintained a doctrine based on technical certainty, now faced the unknown. And it was this unknown that set the stage for the next shock, the one that the German High Command never imagined facing. The discovery that the United States not only had a tank capable of penetrating a Tiger, but that it was ready to mass produce it. German intelligence, which for years had been celebrated as the most accurate in Europe, the pride of the Wehrmacht generals, and the bedrock of Panzerwaffe operations, was facing its first fatal gap at the beginning of 1945. It was not a small failure, nor an operational error. It was an invisible collapse, a blind spot that no analyst in Berlin had predicted. The Germans simply did not know that the M26 Pershing existed. While reports from the front vaguely mentioned a Sherman with a long gun, the German intelligence structure insisted on treating any American vehicle as variations of an old acquaintance, without admitting the possibility of a technological leap. This mistake was born of absolute trust in the past. Germany, which had always thoroughly studied every new Soviet tank, every change in British armor, and every modification in American armament, believed that enemy doctrine remained static. It was arrogance turned into routine. The reconnaissance manuals distributed to the crews of Panthers and Tigers contained only 3 variations of Shermans, none of them equipped with anything even resembling the 90mm cannon that was already silently crossing the Atlantic. Technical charts used in training showed weak American armor, guns unable to pierce a Tiger head-on, and inferior mechanical systems. This information, repeated for years, had become dogma. And dogma in war is always the first enemy to die. By analyzing Allied radio intercepts, German officials concluded that the United States continued to rely solely on quantity. They did not imagine that, behind this flood of Shermans, there was an industry capable of changing the entire production chain in weeks. The historical irony was consolidated when the first reports from the front mentioned the ricochet in Cologne. Intelligence teams initially rejected the testimony, attributing the event to miscalculation, ammunition failure, or misinterpretation in the heat of combat. No one thought that the Americans had a completely new weapon. It was as if the enemy was forbidden to evolve. But evolution had happened, and away from German eyes. While intelligence fell into complacency, the Americans applied administrative camouflage. The Pershings were listed as maintenance equipment, recovery vehicles, or special armor. Allied logistics turned the tank into a shadow, invisible even to those who should find it. This invisibility forced disastrous decisions. The German crews continued to follow the traditional doctrine, keep their distance, use superior optics, rely on frontal armor, but none of this worked against a vehicle they couldn't identify. In several accounts, Tiger commanders opened fire from a distance, believing they were facing ordinary Sherman, only to see his shots ricochet. Others hesitated, believing that the American weapon had been improved, but still not understanding how. The manual, after all, went on to say that no American tank can penetrate a Tiger head-on. It was this phrase that killed dozens of crews. An information hole has turned into a strategic abyss. The absence of recognition forced improvised responses, wrong repositions, ambushes set up for an enemy that no longer existed, and worse, confidence in one's own invulnerability. In some cases, German crews abandoned intact Panthers after spotting a moving, long gun. They didn't know what it was. And in war, fearing what you don't know is natural. The failures were not limited to the crews. The High Command requested detailed reports on the new Sherman. The few documents received described 90mm armament, thick turret, inclined armor. Most of the officers refused to believe it. The standard explanation was always the same: field misjudgment. But the field did not make mistakes. Pershing was there. In the midst of these contradictions, a statistic emerges that helps explain the magnitude of the error. While the Germans still believed that they could recognize every enemy in the visual field, the United States operated more than 50 industrial lines dedicated exclusively to the production and modification of armor, while Germany depended on less than 10 factories, constantly damaged by bombings. If this difference surprises you, comment, "Logistics wins." This disparity prevented the simple act of predicting the arrival of a new tank. The German system was based on the assumption that significant developments would take months, perhaps years, to go into production. There was no understanding of American speed. Intelligence relied more on the predictability of the enemy than on its own ability to recognize changes. That was the decisive failure. By the time they finally admitted that there was an unknown vehicle destroying Panthers head-on, it was too late. The entire Panzerwaffe doctrine, built on distance, reconnaissance, and ballistic superiority, collapsed. The invisible enemy, now visible, had already rewritten the rules, and those rules would become even more unforgiving when the Germans discovered for the first time the true capability of the 90mm gun, a revelation that would emerge not from reports, but from the twisted interior of a Tiger destroyed at the front. The fear did not begin with any explosion. It started with a sighting, a silhouette, a pipe that seemed exaggerated, out of place, too big for a Sherman. Crews trained for years to recognize every inch of an enemy. Armored vehicle began to hesitate when they saw that unexpected outline emerging from among the ruins. German doctrine said that the enemy was predictable, that the Sherman always appeared in large groups, with the same profile, the same rounded turret, the same short gun. But from March 1945 on, something changed. Reports picked up by field radio spoke of a Sherman with a long gun, of an unknown model, of a cannon that looked like anti-aircraft. At first, German units treated these messages as confusion. War erodes perception, some commanders said. Others claimed it was just another British variant. The truth, however, was deeper and more corrosive. The Panzerwaffe encountered for the first time an enemy it did not understand, and what is not understood is feared. The power of the Pershing at that moment was not in the 90mm caliber or the sloped armor. It was in what was invisible, unknowing. German veterans, accustomed to destroying Shermans at long ranges with their Tigers and Panthers, began to doubt. The hesitation first emerged as an isolated reflex, a commander who delayed a shot because he was suspicious of the silhouette, a gunner who waited an extra second trying to confirm the model. Later, this hesitation became standard. In armored duels, the first shot is almost always decisive, and now the Germans were starting to miss that shot because they were no longer sure what they were seeing. The mere sight of that long barrel suspended over a low hull broke the mental algorithm built over 3 years of combat. The doctrine became irrelevant. Self-confidence evaporated, and fear took over. Reports from the Western fronts, compiled by reconnaissance units, began to point to a new phenomenon. Panthers being repositioned without combat. Tigers retreating when they identified shadows they did not recognize. Crews withdrawing from advantageous positions for fear of facing this supposedly modified Sherman. Some commanders even recorded in official reports that they would not engage American armor while the unidentifiable enemy was present. From that point on, the Pershing began to interfere with the battlefield without even firing. The enemy moved for him, adapted positions for him, and increasingly avoided direct confrontation. This psychological impact only increased when the first knocked-out Panthers were examined by German units. The surprise wasn't in the damage, it was in the kind of damage. Clean, circular holes running through frontal armor that, theoretically, no American cannon could penetrate. The inevitable conclusion began to spread. They have a new cannon, but the cannon was not new. It was unknown, and this unknown was devastating. In some German units, rumors began to circulate that the Americans possessed a secret weapon. Others said it was experimental ammunition. Others believed in a manufacturing error by the Panthers. The truth, however, was in industrialization. It was not an experiment. It was a production. And nothing dismantles a myth as quickly as realizing that the enemy can reproduce the same weapon over and over again. The feeling of German invincibility, which had sustained so many battles lost and so many setbacks suffered, began to unravel. Veterans of the Eastern Front, accustomed to overpowering T-34s and IS-2s, began to admit that they were now facing something different, something that destroyed the Tiger head-on, something that German intelligence did not foresee, something that affected instinct before the technique. The result was a silent collapse. German armored patrols, once aggressive, became cautious. The ambushes, once precisely prepared, became hesitant. The attacking formations began to lose pace. The mere sight of that long barrel, even if it was just a modified Sherman or a deceptive angle, went on to destroy more positions than actual shots. The war at that point was no longer decided by armor alone. It was decided by doubt. And that doubt would become absolute when, weeks later, the Germans discovered not only that the Pershing was real, but that it was arriving in ever-increasing numbers, and that its 90mm gun, finally identified, was capable of killing a Tiger at any combat distance in Western Europe. The first reports came in confusing transmissions, almost always intercepted out of order, as if the front itself had difficulty explaining what it had seen. German units stationed along the Rhine began recording encounters with an unusual Sherman, a vehicle whose very long barrel appeared to belong to an anti-aircraft fighter, rather than a medium tank. The descriptions varied so much that they sounded contradictory. Some reported a lower silhouette, others mentioned thick armor, others swore they had seen a shell go through a Panther head-on, but all the reports, without exception, carried the same phrase: "There is a bigger cannon." This repetition, coming from different quarters, revealed a pattern before Berlin could even understand it. Uncertainty had set in. German doctrine relied heavily on visual identification, accurate reading of the enemy silhouette, the ability to predict the optimal distance to destroy a Sherman before he could fight back. But now the crews faced something that broke that cycle. The silhouette did not match. The gun wouldn't match. Logic did not match. Within days, the narrative chaos turned into silent panic. Fragility didn't start in steel. It started in thought. When a crew believes they understand the enemy, they make decisions safely. When he believes he knows the range of his own weapon and the vulnerability of the opposing weapon, he fights with precision. But when these elements fall apart, the crew's mind ceases to be a tool and becomes a burden. With the Pershing, the most lethal weapon in the United States was not the 90mm cannon. It was the German ignorance. The first reports began in the Cologne sector, but quickly spread to the Bonn, Remagen, Euskirchen, and Düsseldorf fronts. In each of these sectors, the same dynamic was repeated. An American tank with a long gun appeared among the ruins, and the Germans, unable to classify it, hesitated. A Panther commander recorded that he opened fire too late because he believed he was facing self-propelled artillery. Another reported that he retreated to an alternative position when he realized that the enemy projectile had unusual behavior. A third declared in later interrogation that he was not sure if the enemy was vulnerable head-on, although he did not yet know that he was facing a Pershing. This pattern, hesitation, doubt, error, spread virally. German crews were conditioned to rely on visual reconnaissance. They recognized every rivet, every weld, every shape of Allied tank turret. But the M26 didn't look like anything. Its wider cast turret eliminated the typical Sherman silhouette. Its 90mm gun protruded forward as a warning. Its sloping armor created the impression of a heavier vehicle, and its ability to fire accurately after short movements further confused those who observed through damaged or soot-soiled periscopes. In a war where perception determines survival, German perception had been sabotaged, not by the Americans, by the Germans themselves, who ignored the possibility that the enemy was evolving. The result was a psychological breakdown that swept across the front like a fever. Units began reporting unidentified vehicles with increasing frequency. Sometimes it was Pershings. Sometimes they were Shermans seen at odd angles. Sometimes they were just shadows cast by fallen buildings. The mind, intoxicated by uncertainty, began to see threats where none existed. The regularity of the reports forced some German commanders to issue cautious orders. Avoid frontal engagement with unknown American tanks. This phrase, written under desperate circumstances, symbolizes the ruin of German doctrine. An army that had spent years dictating the distance and pace of the clashes now retreated in the face of a ghost. In a broadcast intercepted days after the Battle of Cologne, a German commander blurted out, "We can no longer tell which Sherman dies and which Sherman kills." It was the end of predictability. The operational consequences were immediate. German ambushes, once executed with maximum efficiency, began to fail because gunners hesitated at the first shot, and in armored combat, those who hesitate first die. Units that were supposed to hold positions for hours retreated within minutes, when they saw a longer-than-expected metallic glow. The Pershing didn't need to destroy a Tiger to win a battle. It was enough to be seen. The most powerful weapon of the American tank was the damage done to the German certainty. The mind collapsed before the shielding. Fear was cemented as the Germans began to examine destroyed Panthers. Clean holes in the frontal armor, something his manuals said was impossible, could not be ignored. Then came the most devastating rumor of all. Americans have a gun that pierces everything. It was not true. But in war, what you believe carries as much weight as what is real. From that point on, the panic was no longer local. It was structural. German armored units, once protagonists of daring offensives, became defensive shadows, trying to avoid an enemy they did not yet understand. And this mental breakdown set the stage for the most painful revelation of all, when they finally encountered, for the first time, a destroyed Pershing, and realized that the enemy had not only evolved, but had done so in silence, while Germany still believed in its own myth. The German armored doctrine, built over 3 years of war, was based on a simple and mathematically proven principle: keep your distance. It was this pillar that sustained the prestige of the Tiger and the efficiency of the Panther. The German optics saw further. The German gun pierced at greater distances. German armor held up better when the enemy could not get close. The entire tactical edifice of the Panzerwaffe depended on this equation, but the equation only works when all the variables are known. In February 1945, a new variable emerged in the field, and the doctrine, for the first time, did not know how to respond. German crews had been trained extensively to identify targets, calculate distances, pick vulnerable points, and decide engagements with near-scientific precision. Before firing, each commander analyzed 3 factors: the enemy model, frontal armor, and the presumed penetration capability of his own gun. When they faced Shermans, the decision was automatic: to open fire at 1,200, 1,500, or even 2,000 meters. The Americans could only fight back when they reached 600 meters, and that if they were lucky. But the appearance of Pershing dismantled this logic. Now, when an American tank came into the crosshairs, the German commander was not sure what he was seeing. Was it a Sherman? Was it the new long cannon? Was it a vehicle capable of penetrating the Tiger head-on? Uncertainty contaminated every calculation. Doctrine depended on certainty, and certainty had evaporated. In interviews conducted after the war, German veterans described the exact moment when they realized the manual was no longer useful. A gunner of the 2nd Panzer Regiment reported that when he spotted an American tank with an elongated barrel, he hesitated for 3 seconds trying to identify it. In that interval, the enemy fired first. The German armor did not resist. That small delay, 3 seconds, represented the collapse of years of training. Before Pershing, identification was instantaneous. After the Pershing, it became a mortal threat. Doctrine insisted that no American tank could penetrate a Tiger or Panther head-on. But when the first destroyed German vehicles were analyzed, the clean holes in the armor belied everything. The math had changed. The doctrine does not. And crews trained to rely on numbers were now faced with new numbers they had never been taught. The problem was not just technical, it was psychological. When doctrine fails, the mind looks for alternatives. But there were no alternatives. Germany had no other tactic. There were no substitutes. He had no reservations. I didn't have time. The Wehrmacht's Armored Combat Manual, revised in 1944, devoted entire pages to the Sherman's technical description: 75mm gun, lower armor, vulnerable turret, low effectiveness at long range. All these statements were on paper. None were true in the face of Pershing. The manual also stated that Panthers should avoid urban combat against American tanks. But it was precisely in urban areas that the Pershings first appeared, and with brutal effectiveness. The narrow streets of Cologne, Remagen, and Bonn nullified the German range, brought vehicles closer together, and turned the long distance, the German advantage, into a useless memory. The doctrine was like a broken compass. It kept pointing north, but the north was no longer there. Another element of German doctrine that collapsed was the concept of optical superiority. Zeiss optics were one of Germany's technological gems, but faced with an enemy who could destroy a Tiger head-on, seeing far no longer helped. Seeing far only showed that death came faster than mathematics predicted. With the Pershing's infiltration of the American lines, German doctrine even lost control of engagements. Before, it was the Tigers who chose when to fight. Now the Americans approached fearlessly, confident in the capability of the 90mm gun. The initiative, a vital element of armored warfare, changed hands. German doctrine required the Tiger to be a mobile fortress, a battlefield arbiter. Pershing turned him into a defendant. German doctrinal incapacity became so evident that in mid-March, emergency orders were sent from the High Command. Crews were to avoid frontal engagement with unidentified American tanks. This simple and ambiguous sentence represented something profound. German doctrine had renounced its confidence. The manual was now a relic. War required a new logic, but there was no time to create it. The German underestimation was not only technical, was doctrinal. They believed that the enemy would never reach the technical level of the Tiger. They believed that Sherman would always be the same. They believed that American industry was incapable of mass-producing heavy armor. And when these pillars fell, there was nothing left. Highly trained crews were left without direction. Experienced commanders were left without parameters. The Panzerwaffe for the first time was left without answers. And this absence of answers would become even more painful when the Germans discovered something even more disturbing, that the Americans had not only created a new tank, but that they were already quietly working on even heavier models, capable of outperforming even the Tiger II. American industrial superiority was not only manifested in the cold numbers of the reports, it revealed itself in the very rhythm of war, in the rhythm at which tanks appeared, were destroyed, and reappeared at the front, as if they had been multiplied during the night. While Germany celebrated each new Tiger as a piece of near craftsmanship, precision assembled, made up of hundreds of components that required highly skilled labor, the United States was preparing something completely different. A system, not an isolated tank, but a national machine capable of producing, adapting, and replacing armored vehicles with the regularity of a metronome. The great irony was that at the height of German belief in its technical supremacy, the war had already turned into a conflict of industrial capacity. Germany could make a Tiger, the US could make 1,000, and the Pershing was born out of exactly that contrast, not from a race to build the best possible tank, but from the ability to produce enough to turn the tide of the war. In American factories, an M4 Sherman could be assembled in a few hours, thanks to integrated, standardized, and replicable industrial processes. When the decision was made to convert part of these lines to produce the M26 Pershing, the transition happened without interrupting the main flow. Automated lines were readjusted, tooling was changed, subcontractors received new projects, and within weeks, the tank that was supposed to balance the battlefield was already being assembled alongside the old Shermans, without production slowing down. Meanwhile, in Germany, each Tiger absorbed full days of assembly, with parts coming from constantly bombed factories, disrupted transports, and skilled labor disappearing. A single damaged Tiger required time, rare parts, and experienced crews, all things that Germany had less and less of. The logic was cruel and unforgiving. For every Tiger produced, the United States could produce dozens of Pershings if it wanted to, and hundreds of Shermans. At one point, the equation became so unfavorable to the Germans that the commanders themselves admitted that there was no way to make up such a difference. The psychological impact of this disparity hit the German crews before they even realized what they were up against. When the first reports of Pershing emerged, many believed it to be an isolated, rare, perhaps experimental project. But the reality was harsher. American factories were capable of producing the M26 at scale. What the German crews thought was an anomaly was actually the beginning of a new generation of armor that could be easily replaced. This fact radically alters the way armored warfare is perceived. Germany struggled to keep its Tigers intact. Every loss was irrecoverable. The United States could accept losses, learn from them, upgrade the tank, and send it back to the front in the same month. The difference between an artisanal army and an industrial army became evident. And there is one fact that evidences this asymmetry with brutal clarity. While Germany produced about 2,300 Tigers in the entire war, the United States produced more than 2,200 Pershings by October 1945. If this ratio surprises you, comment on absolute power. This is the essence of industrial warfare. A vehicle is not only worth for what it does, but for the fact that it can be repeated indefinitely. The fear that the Pershing caused was not just fear of the tank before their eyes, but of the tank that would come after. And then. Germany understood that its capacity for replacement was at its limit. while the American had barely begun. The Panzerwaffe, accustomed to treating each Tiger as a unique and irreplaceable piece, had to face the reality that the Americans could mass-produce tanks that technically matched it. It was a defeat, not only in the field, but in the logic of war. Production concentrated at the Grand Blanc arsenal, and the Detroit tank arsenal formed a complete manufacturing ecosystem, with 300 subcontractors and more than 50,000 dedicated workers able to reconfigure entire lines in a matter of days. Germany, on the other hand, relied on vulnerable, dispersed and insufficient lines. Each bomb dropped by the Allies meant weeks lost in the production of Panthers and Tigers. Each rail disruption meant dozens of incomplete tanks gathering dust in the sheds. It was as if Germany had entered a math war knowing that it would lose all equations. The realization of this industrial chasm began to seep into the minds of German crews. When they captured American documents or talked to prisoners, they discovered that the United States had not only developed Pershing, but that it already had plans for larger increments, thicker armor, even more powerful guns, revised turrets, improved engines. While Germany struggled to keep a Tiger running, the United States tested prototypes such as the T-29 and T-30, heavy tanks that never needed to enter combat because the war ended earlier. This conveyed a devastating message to any German soldier. Even if they survived the Pershing, there was still something worse coming after him. Morale began to crumble when crews realized that for every American tank destroyed, 2 could reach the front in the following month. Germany, even at its peak, never had this capability. This understanding destroys not only tactical confidence, but the very motivation to fight. If the enemy can replace himself, but you can't, war ceases to be a matter of bravery and becomes a matter of time. That was the coup that the Pershing represented. Not just the armor-piercing weapon, but the symbol of the industry capable of mass manufacturing it. And that industrial shadow would get even heavier when the Germans discovered that the real devastation was not in the M26, but in the speed with which it could be multiplied. The next revelation would make it clear that what the Germans faced in 1945 was only the beginning of what the United States was ready to produce. The German veterans who arrived on the Western Front in 1945 were no ordinary soldiers. They were men molded in fire in the vastness of the steppe, accustomed to destroying entire columns of T-34s, to facing waves of Soviet armored vehicles with the coldness of those who fully trust their machine and their doctrine. For them, the war had a clear logic. German engineering was superior, German training was superior, German discipline was superior. That conviction, repeated over the years and reinforced by hard-fought victories, had become more than a belief. It was an identity. And when they arrived in the West, they carried with them this last certainty intact. The Western enemy, although numerous, would never match German technology. They had seen Shermans burn effortlessly. They had faced the British and Americans with the security of those who control distance, cadence, and impact. To them, the Tiger was more than a tank. It was the living symbol of a Germany that could still win. But that security began to crumble the moment they found the Pershing. Not because they had lost dozens of duels, but because the logic that underpinned them had been broken. The first shock was not tactical, but emotional. Upon encountering Panthers destroyed head-on, Eastern veterans refused to believe that an American tank could have done such damage. Some attributed the impact to Soviet ammunition. Others suggested that the Panther had been hit by 80-18mm flak recovered by the enemy. Others, in silence, stared at the clean hole in the armor as if they were facing a heresy. It was as if reality itself was wrong. Their training said that no American cannon had the strength to do so. Experience confirmed this doctrine. His years of combat proved it. But there, in front of that broken armor, this whole mental structure began to unravel. The doctrine did not err. So how to explain the inexplicable? Early reports about the Pershing spread as rumors of superstition. Some veterans insisted that it was an isolated case. Others believed that the Americans had concentrated specialized weapons in a single sector. But the rumor grew, multiplied, and the evidence soon became too solid to deny. In battles near Bonn, veterans of the Eastern Front found entire units retreating before they could even engage, something they had not seen since the darkest moments of the 1943 retreat. They asked the local units why they were so afraid, and they always received the same answer. The enemy has a new cannon. It was a small sentence, but its devastation was immense. The American cannon, the cannon they despised, now pierced that which should be untouchable. This realization struck veterans with an impact that no explosion could replicate. The emotional breakdown became evident when veterans began requesting instructions from the high command on how to confront the unknown model. They, who had once been the self-sufficient elite of the Panzerwaffe, now asked for guidance in the face of an enemy they had hitherto considered technically inferior. Pride has turned into restlessness, confidence turned into doubt. The realization that the Americans had achieved technical parity was tantamount to many as an acknowledgement that the war had come to an end, not because there was a shortage of men or ammunition, but because the latter certainty was lacking. The enemy they thought incapable of evolving now mastered a technology that surprised them, and in the German mind, this meant that the entire narrative of racial, industrial, and military superiority had been invalidated. A Grossdeutschland veteran, captured in April 1945, summed up this sentiment by saying, "If they now have tanks equal to ours, and in greater numbers, then nothing is left." The psychological impact of this discovery was so profound that several veteran units recently transferred from the East lost their characteristic aggressiveness. Some experienced commanders recorded that their men no longer maintained the same confident posture when they saw Allied armor. The old logic, "the Sherman needs to get closer," has disappeared. Now they were the ones who doubted their own advantage, and when the veteran doubts, the rookie falls apart. In mixed units, composed of experienced soldiers and young recruits, this mental imbalance created irreparable cracks. Veterans, once a source of strength, became bearers of a devastating pessimism that spread rapidly. The loss of this last belief, the belief in superiority, had a direct effect on the field. Crews that had previously fought to complete destruction began to abandon positions at the first sign of threat. Commanders who had previously led bold advances began to opt for preemptive retreats. The Panzerwaffe ceased to be the predator of armored warfare and became the prey of an industrial logic that it could never match. German engineering, brilliant as it was surrounded by an uncomfortable reality. Americans could replicate its technology. Germany could not replicate theirs. This ideological blow was so profound that in later interrogations, several veterans declared that the war was over for them the moment they discovered that the Americans had heavy tanks. It was not the impact of a projectile, but the moral impact of realizing that they were fighting an enemy that had achieved what had been promised to them as exclusive to Germany. It was the end of an era, the end of a certainty, and this lost certainty would reveal something even more disturbing in the next stage of the war. The realization that the Pershing was not the end of American evolution, it was only the beginning. The paralysis began with a misidentification. A Panther parked south of Bonn, spotted among the haze of smoke and pulverized bricks, the distant silhouette of an American tank surfacing behind a destroyed block. The commander watched the outline for only 2 seconds. A low hull, a barrel that seemed too long to be an ordinary M4. Nothing else was needed. The order was immediate. Abandon vehicle. The Panther was left intact, engine running, ammunition full. There were no shots. There was no combat. There was only the presence of something that was perhaps a Pershing. This episode, recorded by interrogations after the war, was not isolated. Several German crews began to abandon Tigers and Panthers without even engaging the enemy, not out of cowardice but out of something deeper, the breaking of logic. The battlefield, which could once be read as a map of probabilities and distances, had become a cloudy board where any piece could prove fatal. When each Sherman became a possible Pershing, the fear took definitive shape. The sight of a long barrel, even if it was just the reflection of a 76mm gun or the distorted angle of an M4, became a psychological trigger. Veteran crews, trained to operate on the mathematical certainty of their own weapons, now faced absolute uncertainty. They did not know whether to face an easy target or an opponent who could destroy them with a single frontal shot. Ballistics is no longer a science. It became a guess. In units in the Düsseldorf sector, reports mentioned hastily repositioned Panthers, Tigers retreating without direct contact, and reconnaissance teams avoiding approaches that months earlier would have been routine. The enemy was not winning by the number of shots, but by the pressure it exerted on German thought. Hesitation set in where precision once reigned, and armored warfare does not forgive those who hesitate. On a front near the Ruhr River, a crew of Tiger recorded what would be, for many historians, the symbol of Pershing's psychological warfare. The commander observed an American tank at about 1,300 meters, advancing slowly between burned buildings. He could not determine whether it was a regular Sherman or the new model. The distance was perfect for a well-aimed shot. Any German instructor would have said that this was the ideal time to neutralize the enemy. But the commander did not fire. He feared that if he were a Pershing, he would fight back hard enough to kill his Tiger in the same instant. This psychological fracture, the fear of facing something that might have been there, nullified all German offensive potential. In the end, the crew retreated to a secondary position. The American tank, ironically, was just an ordinary Sherman, but the battle was already lost, not in steel, but in mind. This phenomenon became so recurrent that the German High Command began issuing urgent instructions to try to restore armored confidence. The orders said that reports of the new American tank were being exaggerated, that the Panthers remained superior, that the battlefield required aggressiveness, but these words sent by radio and distributed on typewritten sheets were small compared to the brutal reality observed in the ruins of German cities. When destroyed Panthers were examined, the clean holes of frontal penetration could not be explained by the manuals. The visual evidence contradicted the propaganda, and in war what the eyes see is stronger than any order received. This distrust was also manifested in the warehouses and repair shops. Records show that crews began declaring tanks as inoperable for minor failures, misaligned rails, overheated engines, minor suspension failures. These were problems that months before would be solved on the field with his own hands. Now they served as a silent justification to avoid returning to combat. The war had turned into a territory where the mind sought ways to escape. The realization that the enemy had a weapon capable of neutralizing even his heavy tanks caused a psychological breakdown that could not be reversed. In urban sectors, the effect was even more devastating. The narrow streets and reduced visual field made it impossible to quickly distinguish between an ordinary Sherman and a Pershing. At every turn, at every corner, at every shadow, the same question arose. Is it the cannon long? Doubt slowed the pace of advance. Delayed attacks compromised ambushes. Units that previously performed maneuvers with surgical precision began to operate as if they were stepping on minefield. It didn't matter if Pershing was present or not. The mere possibility of his presence was enough to make every German action slower, more tense, more fragile. And, as in any war, those who lose the rhythm lose the initiative. One of the most symbolic accounts came from a Waffen-SS veteran who declared years later in an interview, "Of all the Allied tanks I faced, only one I feared, the one I couldn't identify." This phrase sums up the impact of the M26 on the German imagination. It wasn't the armor, nor the caliber, nor the speed. It was ignorance. The invisible enemy, the tank that might have been there, the long cannon that could appear at any moment and turn all odds against the Panzerwaffe. Fear, once the psychological monopoly of the Germans, has changed sides. The war at that point was already inevitably lost for Germany, but the Pershing anticipated that defeat by weeks, perhaps months, by destroying not only tanks, but the confidence that sustained combat. The collapse was not just technical or material, it was mental. The Pershing won battles simply by existing, a rare feat in military history, reserved only for weapons that can destroy beliefs before destroying machines. And this psychological destruction would become even more evident when the Germans discovered something more disturbing. The Pershing had bigger brothers, American prototypes capable of surpassing even the Tiger II, waiting only for the order to go into production. The operational disintegration did not begin with explosions, but with excuses. In mid-March 1945, messages began to arrive at the German High Command, reporting Panthers abandoned for lack of fuel, Tigers left behind for misfire, Jagd Panthers parked in ravines after loss of traction. But it was enough to analyze the vehicles captured by the Allies to realize that none of this was true. The tanks were intact. The fuel levels were sufficient. The breakdowns mentioned were no more than minor problems that, in 1943, would be solved in minutes by any frontline crew. The war did not suffer a mechanical crisis. It suffered a psychological breakdown. The engine that had seized up was that of confidence. The soldiers did not abandon their tanks because they were broken. They abandoned because they believed that the next confrontation would be against an enemy they could not identify, predict, or defeat. The mere possibility that a Pershing was ahead made any failure the perfect justification for avoiding combat. The irony of this story is that the Germans looked to tanks for problems that actually existed only in themselves. If you are enjoying unraveling these facts, Like and subscribe so that we can bring you more detailed content. The accounts collected after the war show a pattern so consistent that it needs no interpretation. Experienced crews began to develop an aversion to armored engagement. In 1944 in Normandy, a Panther crew would continue to fight despite missing tracks, an overheating engine, or a damaged radio. In 1943 on the Eastern Front, a Tiger would operate for days at a time with serious transmission failures. But in 1945, a simple creak in the gears was grounds for total abandonment. The difference was in the enemy. Before, they knew what they were up against. Now they didn't even know what to look for in their sights. Pershing didn't need to be present. Suspicion was enough. In units defending the Ruhr accesses, commanders began to record that their men were reluctant to reposition vehicles or failed to complete patrol orders. In retreat operations, Panthers were found in ditches, not because of combat damage, but because the crews simply drove them off the road and fled. In other sectors, state-of-the-art Tigers were parked with engines running until they burned out from excess heat. The crew had abandoned the tank without even turning it off. When interrogated, they said the same phrase: "We think there were Pershings in the area." Fear had replaced discipline. The invisible enemy interfered more on the battlefield than any visible weapon. German doctrine, which called for aggressiveness, coordination, and precision, became impossible to apply when crews came to fear every armored encounter. Confidence in technical superiority, the last thread that held the Panzerwaffe together, had been broken. Without it, the German armored army was just a set of heavy hulls with powerful engines, but commanded by men who no longer believed in victory. The abandonment of tanks became so common that logistics officers had to create protocols to collect armored vehicles left behind in perfect condition. In some American offensives, more Panthers were captured intact than destroyed in combat. In the Remagen region, units reported spontaneous crew escape in the face of American tanks that did not even know whether they were Shermans or Pershings. The difference had ceased to matter. Any American armored vehicle had become an existential threat. This operational collapse had a direct impact on American maneuvers. In sectors where intelligence expected days' resistance, German lines collapsed within hours. The Pershings were few in number, about 20 in combat, but their shadow weighed over every German decision. When an American tank appeared in the distance, the Germans no longer assessed its silhouette. They evaluated their own survival. If it was a Sherman, they could fight. If it were a Pershing, the fight would be over quickly, and not in their favor. This doubt paralyzed the action. Instead of advancing, they retreated. Instead of ambushing, they dispersed. Instead of attacking, they waited. And waiting, in war, is another name for defeat. The disintegration did not occur only in the armored vehicles. Mechanized infantry units that had relied on the presence of the Panthers as a backbone began to operate without support. Troops waiting for Tiger's cover would advance alone, only to find that their tanks had been abandoned miles away. The Panzerwaffe ceased to be a coordinated force and became a collection of isolated pieces, without communication, without trust, and without continuity. By the end of March, German commanders no longer knew how many tanks they actually had at their disposal, because many were abandoned in forests, barns, ruins, or roadsides, left behind by crews who decided that fighting no longer made sense. The Pershing had achieved something that neither the T-34 nor the IS-2 nor Soviet numerical superiority had achieved, breaking the emotional link between the Germans and their tanks. A Tiger is only invincible when its crew believes in it. By 1945, that belief had died. And the final blow was yet to come, a technical breakthrough that would make the Germans realize that the M26 was not the American pinnacle, but only the first step in an even more devastating project. The technical comparison between the Pershing, the Tiger, and the Panther reveals a truth that at first glance seems to contradict the terror that took over the Panzerwaffe in 1945. The M26 was not a super tank. He was not unbeatable. It was not in isolation superior to the Tiger II, nor did it have the same frontal armor that turned it into a 68-ton wall. And yet, none of these facts mattered in the psychological field of war. To understand this irony, it is necessary to dismantle the myth from all sides. In pure engineering terms, the Tiger I remained a respectable armored vehicle, 100 mm of flat frontal armor, an 80 mm KWK 36 gun capable of destroying any Sherman at more than 1,800 meters, and a superior optical system that turned well-trained crews into tracked snipers. The Tiger II, on the other hand, was a colossus, 150 millimeters of sloping frontal armor and an even more powerful gun, the KWK-43, which made most of the Allied tanks of 1944 frontally invulnerable. The Panther, although designed as the middle brother, combined excellent sloped armor with one of the best 75mm guns of the war. The KWK-42, fast, accurate, and extremely effective. In strictly mathematical terms, Pershing did not surpass these machines. Its 102mm frontal armor, although sloped, did not reach the endurance of the Tiger II. Its 90mm M3 gun had excellent penetration, but fired slower than the German 88mm. Its transmission was less robust than that of the Panther, and in speed, it was between the two German models. Objectively, he was an equal, not a superior, but war is rarely decided by isolated numbers. Ergonomics, field of view, internal ammunition arrangement, and ease of operation shape the real performance of a machine, and in this territory the Pershing began to take on another identity: the spacious turret, ammunition stored in wet compartments, the gun stabilization system that allowed for more accurate firing after short movements, and the smooth steering wheel offered something the Germans deeply underestimated: operational efficiency. While the Tiger relied on the physical strength of the loader and the Panther often suffered from overheating, the Pershing was designed to run smoothly, to be repaired quickly, to be operated with less fatigue. A tank is not just steel, it is also the man who operates that steel. In a head-to-head duel, a Tiger II still posed a clear threat to the Pershing, but in a long campaign, under constant pressure, with scarce supplies, the tank that offers the operator the best working conditions tends to fight better for longer. And it is at this point that the central irony of this part emerges. Despite not being the most armored tank, nor the most powerful, nor the fastest, the Pershing had exactly what Germany did not believe the United States would be able to produce: an effective, consistent, and replicable heavy armor. The shock did not come from the metal, it came from the broken narrative. To the German soldier, the Sherman represented the mental image of the Western enemy: light, vulnerable, numerous, and technically inferior. The appearance of a tank that broke this paradigm did not meet resistance only in duels. It found resistance in the mind. The Panzerwaffe was not prepared for a new category of enemy. There were no manuals, there were no specific tactics, there were no official recommendations. The ballistic calculations that underpinned German confidence were suddenly nullified, and when the mind loses the numbers, the steel loses its value. The Pershing's superior ergonomics, stabilized sights, and ability to engage accurately in conditions that were previously exclusive to Germany turned the Detroit tank into something even more dangerous than a Tiger: a surprise. In war, surprise is a devastating weapon. The German panic was not born of repeated duels. It was born from the first successful shot, from the first frontal penetration, from the first Panther destroyed by something that was not on the reconnaissance charts. It was born from the exact moment when the technical certainty accumulated over 3 years dissolved in the cold air of March 1945. The Pershing didn't need to outdo the Tiger II, it just needed to destroy the myth of the Tiger. And it did so without firing thousands of shots, without forming entire battalions, without statistically dominating the battlefield. Just as a small number of stealth aircraft redefine air warfare, a small number of innovative tanks redefine armored warfare. The fear that ran through the Panzerwaffe did not come from objective reality, but from doubt. German tanks began to retreat before they even confirmed the enemy. Ambushes are no longer set up. Crews began to examine each silhouette with anxiety. The battlefield became unrecognizable, and this transformation is only possible when a tank goes beyond its physical dimension and enters the psychological dimension, the territory where the war is actually won. The final irony, and perhaps the most bitter one for the Germans, is that the M26 Pershing did not represent the pinnacle of American technology, but the beginning. It was a transitional product, a matured prototype, hurriedly sent to the front. Germany believed it had found its new outright rival. I did not know that the United States was already testing tanks with 105mm guns, 155mm guns, even thicker armor and advanced transmission systems. If the Pershing, only the first step, had already shaken the Panzerwaffe, what came after could have completely redefined the post-war armored landscape. This unexpected revelation, hidden behind the dust of the American assembly line, would be the blow that was missing for the Germans to realize that the real threat was not in the M26, but in what it announced. Nazi ideology has always maintained that German strength came from an inevitable combination of racial superiority and technical genius, as if the steel of the Tigers carried in every inch the signature of a historical destiny. Propaganda repeated that no people could match German precision, that no foreign worker could understand the art of armored engineering, that no chaotic democracy would be able to produce anything comparable to the Panther or the Tiger II. It was faith, but that faith began to crumble at the very moment that the first reports of a new American tank emerged, an unknown, heavy tank capable of piercing the frontal armor of a Tiger, something that had previously been considered impossible. For the crews who had been taught to view the United States as an industrially backward nation, powered by amateurs, capitalists, and improvised conscripts, reality struck hard. The cannon that now threatened their lives had been built by workers whom the Nazi regime despised. On American assembly lines, women operated presses and welded Pershing towers, while blacks worked on Ford Gaff engines. European immigrants smelted steel in newly assembled production units, and unions negotiated shifts while keeping factories running day and night. Germany called this weakness. By 1945, it proved to be the largest force ever mobilized in industrial history. The very idea that a nation's worth lay in its racial purity became untenable when the inferior enemy produced a tank that nullified the German masterpiece. The psychological impact was devastating. Veteran crews, accustomed to associating the average American with an unprepared soldier, found that this same American now arrived at the front, protected by a machine whose cast turret was more advanced than any German metallurgical technique had been able to stabilize. The myth of technical supremacy collapsed, as if it had been hit not by a 90mm projectile, but by a fact too inconvenient for ideology to bear. In post-war interrogations, several German officers admitted to ideological shock. One of them stated that it was not just a new weapon, it was proof that we were wrong from the start. Another declared that the existence of the Pershing killed more than tanks. It killed the belief that we were better. Nazi Germany had built its discourse on the notion that democratic societies were fragile, disorganized, and incapable of producing anything that required industrial discipline. However, it was precisely a plural, noisy, and unequal democracy that manufactured the tanks capable of equaling and surpassing the best engineers in the Reich. The irony became impossible to ignore. The Tiger, a machine symbol of German purity, was defeated by an armored vehicle born of a workforce that represented everything that Nazi ideology considered degenerate. The doctrine that promised world domination based on technical superiority proved incapable of surviving the confrontation with a country that transformed diversity into an industrial power. In the abandoned corridors of German factories, where steel, fuel, and labor were lacking, the comparison became even more cruel. While the regime deported millions and destroyed its own productive base with self-destructive racial policies, the United States expanded industrial parks, integrated previously excluded social groups, and converted civilian lines into military plants with unprecedented speed. It was the triumph not only of Pershing, but of a model of society. And as more crews discovered that the American tank threatening them was not the result of a secret laboratory, but of a production system that involved ordinary citizens, the demoralization deepened. There was no way to sustain the ideological justification that had sustained 3 years of armored combat. When the myth splits, the machine loses meaning. The Panzerwaffe realized too late that the war was not being decided only on the front line, but on the social structure that fed each factory. And the instant this perception set in, moral collapse became inevitable. And yet, this revelation was not the most devastating. There was something even deeper, a discovery that would widen the psychological blow and expose the final chasm between belief and reality. The next part reveals this last ideological wound, the moment when the Germans knew what, in fact, the United States was already building beyond the Pershing. The quiet unveiling of the 90mm gun didn't just alter isolated duels, it reconfigured the entire behavior of the Western Front in the last 60 days of the war. Each new report, a Panther destroyed from the front, a Tiger neutralized at medium range, a veteran crew retreating after seeing a longer barrel, reinforced the idea that something fundamental had changed. What had begun as a noise, an inaccurate rumor coming from the Rhineland, became a strategic certainty. The enemy now possessed a tank capable of nullifying the last German advantage. And this realization alone had operational consequences that no Oberkommando general had anticipated. In March 1945, German units that still possessed Tigers and Panthers retreated from entire sectors before even confronting American armor. Reconnaissance patrols began reporting imaginary sightings of Shermans with long guns, and each new encounter added to the impression that Pershings were everywhere, even when they barely numbered 20 at the front. The military logic dissolved in the face of the psychological weight. The daily reports sent to the High Command began to mention an alarming pattern: abandoned tanks with fuel in the tank, ammunition stockpiled, and engines running. Panthers left with minimal damage, such as trails that could be replaced in minutes. Abandoned Tigers without any visible damage. The crews simply no longer believed that it was worth fighting for. The potential presence of the 90mm gun nullified the most precious calculation of German armored doctrine: risk versus reward. Before, the Tigers were compared to the Shermans. Now each advance could mean encountering a weapon that destroyed in a single shot what represented years of propaganda and technical confidence. The most dramatic effect came on the Ruhr border. In early April, entire units of the Wehrmacht refused to carry out counterattack orders because there were no guarantees that only Shermans were present. The simple fact that no reliable method existed to differentiate regular Shermans from Pershings from distance created an unprecedented operational paralysis. The fear of doubt became stronger than the certainty of defeat. When questioned after the war, several commanders admitted that from March onwards, the decision to engage or retreat no longer depended on one's own strength, but on the possibility, only possibility, of engaging a Pershing. One major reported that he advised his company to abandon defensive positions in the Kassel region because a single tank capable of destroying Tigers frontally changes the whole math. Germany was beginning to lose battles that had not even been fought. The multiplier effect of this fear was reflected in the speed with which the German lines broke. The crossing of the Rhine by American forces was expected, according to estimates by the High Command, to last weeks. It lasted for days. In the Remagen sector, where the US Army had captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact, German armored units were ordered to hold off the advance until reinforcements arrived. But at the first rumor of Pershing's presence, 3 battalions retreated without firing a shot. It wasn't the bridge that collapsed, it was trust. In the Paderborn region, the U.S. 3rd Armored Division recorded a phenomenon that would repeat itself for the next few days. German columns surrendering to smaller American units, believing that Pershings were in support. In one of the most symbolic reports of the final phase of the war, an SS lieutenant explained that he surrendered because there was no longer any hope of victory when the enemy equals our technique. In this sentence, the entire ideological collapse that had sustained the German machine for years echoed. The internal command messages also reveal the invisible impact of the 90mm gun. On April 17th, a circular sent by General Oberst Heinz Guderian, already in political and military collapse, instructed that reports about heavy American tanks should be treated as exaggerated. It was too late. The war was lost not only in the material field, but in the psychological field. The crews no longer believed what they were told. His eyes had seen the impossible. His certainties had been broken. Disorganization became widespread. Units that previously resisted until the penultimate bullet began to seek escape routes. Advanced armor, such as the Tiger II, were left intact on the roads, and the Panzerwaffe, once the pride of Germany, dissolved within weeks. It is significant that in this period the US Army still had fewer than 3 dozen operational Pershings. Their impact on the war was not the result of numbers, but of symbolism. A single well-aimed shot at Cologne had rewritten 3 years of German supremacy. Germany was defeated by the revelation that its last trump card was no longer worth anything in the face of the industrial power of an adversary that could produce, innovate, and adapt with superior speed. And yet the effect of the 90mm still had one last consequence, the most profound and brutal of all. The Germans would only discover later that the Pershing was only the beginning of what the United States was prepared to put into the camps of Europe. The next part reveals this invisible threat, hidden behind the dust of American factories. the tanks that were on the way, and that Germany would never be able to cope with. When April 1945 dawned over an exhausted Germany, there was no longer any doubt within the High Command itself. The Panzerwaffe had not collapsed under the weight of explosives, but under the weight of a revelation. The first well-aimed shot of a Pershing at a Tiger weeks earlier had gone through more than steel. It had pierced the Reich's last strategic illusion. The belief in German technical superiority, sustained by 3 years of propaganda, doctrine, and isolated tactical victories, crumbled in the face of the realization that democratic engineering had reached and surpassed the armored myth of Nazism. With every retreat, every tank abandoned intact, every order disobeyed, it was evident that the combat had ended long before the formal surrender. It had ended when the German mind ceased to believe that its tanks were unbeatable. The ideological defeat came before the military defeat, and the 90 millimeters of the Pershing was the instrument of this invisible collapse. The lesson that emerges from this story is old, but it gains new strength when observed on this scale. No matter how brilliant the engineers, how trained the crews, or how deadly the weapon, without an industrial base capable of sustaining, replacing, adapting, and innovating, the technical advantage evaporates like smoke. The Pershing did not win battles for numerical superiority. He won because he revealed something bigger, that America possessed industrial reserves capable of altering the course of the war at any moment. While Germany struggled to produce 100 tanks a month, the United States made 1,000, and still found room to develop an entirely new armored vehicle, test it, perfect it, and field it before the enemy even knew it existed. In the end, the 90mm represented more than firepower. It represented the triumph of a flexible, plural, and tireless economic system. In any war, strategy is born from the factories. Tactics just execute it. The mind that believes it controls the battlefield but ignores the industrial rear is already defeated. Germany itself has admitted this. In one of the most revealing testimonies collected after the war, a captured general stated, "We were not defeated by tanks. We were defeated by factories. We were defeated by trucks." This dry and bitter phrase sums up all the irony of the story you just followed. Pershing's cannon killed a tiger, but it was American industry that killed the myth. If you value serious research, technical analysis, and the search for historical truth, please like and subscribe to the channel. This strengthens our work and allows us to continue bringing stories that go beyond the surface. Comment on what was the most shocking fact of this video: the abandonment of intact Panthers, the German inability to identify Pershing, the revelation that only 20 tanks caused panic in entire battalions, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact that we are going to reveal here. Because this story is not over yet. A tank that overthrew an ideology is just the beginning. There are other truths buried under smoke, steel, and silence, stories as astonishing as this one, waiting to be unraveled. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.